If I were to tell you that Socrates is sitting, how could you determine whether I was telling the truth or not? You might be asking yourself, do I know anyone named Socrates? Didn't the famous Socrates die thousands of years ago? So how could he be sitting, standing, or doing anything else? Why is Father Ambrose asking me such strange questions? Well, you're on the right track. Let's figure out what this has to do with understanding St. Thomas Aquinas' fourth proof for the existence of God. In the past few episodes of Aquinas 101, we have been examining the 7 steps of St. Thomas's fourth way for proving the existence of God. In the previous episode, we saw how it is that truth can come in degrees of more or less in step 2. Steps 1 and 2 naturally show the truth of step 3. There must be some instance where the properties of being good, true, noble, etc. are all found to a maximal degree. In today's episode, we shall look at step 4. Let's begin by remembering what step 4 says. It goes like this. If there is something that is maximally true, then there is something that is maximally being. At first glance, this step seems to make a giant leap. How can it be the case that if there is something maximally true, then there must be something that is maximally being? The reason is that truth depends on the way things are. That is, truth depends on being. What do I mean? Well, take the statement, Socrates is sitting. Is this statement true or false? That depends on whether or not there is a person, Socrates, who is actually sitting at this moment. If that person, who is called Socrates, is really sitting, then the statement, Socrates is sitting, is true. If that person is not actually sitting, either because he is standing or because he died thousands of years ago, then the statement is false. In general, the truth or falsity of a statement depends on whether or not the real world is such. In other words, truth depends upon being. Now, in the common English translation of the text of the Summa, editors have inserted a citation that leads us to Aristotle's Metaphysics, Book 2, Chapter 1. In that chapter, Aristotle explains how it is that one thing can be truer than another. As we noted last time, one statement can be more or less true than another statement based upon how much of reality it expresses. Aristotle builds on that point in Metaphysics, Book 2, Chapter 1. He points out that statements about things that always exist have a greater degree of truth than statements about things that sometimes exist and sometimes do not exist. Why? Because true statements about things that always exist are never wrong, whereas statements about things that only exist for a time, for instance, statements about whether or not Socrates is sitting, can be false at certain times. In that way, they are less true. Aristotle is presuming in this point an interesting fact about the existence of things. Things that always exist have a greater share in being than things that come into existence and go out of existence. This is because things that come into existence and go out of existence need something else to bring them into existence, and therefore depend for their existence on whatever it is that causes them. But things that always exist do not need something to bring them into existence. Therefore, they are said to have more being because they depend less on other things in order to exist, since they exist for all time. We can illustrate this point with the example that St. Thomas uses, namely the example of heat and fire. We can say that fire has more heat than a tea kettle when the flame is heating the kettle, because fire is the cause of the heat in the tea kettle. The kettle is only hot insofar as the fire is heating it, whereas the fire is hot just because it is fire. In this way, the fire is hotter than the kettle by being the source of heat in the kettle. Likewise with things that exist. Those that depend on something else to come into existence at some time are like the kettle. They need something else to make them exist. But things that always exist have existence as part of their nature, and so have more being insofar as they depend less on other things to exist. Now let's go back to the argument. Something is true because of the way things are. Something is more or less true depending on whether that thing has more or less being. What this means is that if there are things that are more or less true, then there are things that are more or less being. This must be the case even if we do not know what those greater or lesser beings are. What is more, as we noted earlier, if truth comes in degrees, then it must also have a maximal truth. For when there are degrees of a property, then there must be a maximal of that property. Therefore, there must be something that is maximally true. With these statements in mind, we can see that if there is something that is maximally true, then there must be something that is maximally being, since truth comes from the way things are. There is more to say here, but I think that is all we have time for today. The key takeaway point for today is that if we think that something is true because of the way the world is, and if we know that there are degrees of truth, then the degrees of truth must coincide with degrees of being. And that is enough to show the truth of step 4. If step 4 is true, then step 5 follows based upon our previous discussion. For remember that step 5 simply states that there must be something that is maximally being, since there is something that is maximally true. And with that, we are now more than halfway through St. Thomas's fourth way for proving the existence of God. Next time, we will race to the end and see the exciting conclusion of the argument: God exists. Until then, may God bless you and keep you in His grace. For readings, podcasts, and more videos like this, go to Aquinas101.com. While you're there, be sure to sign up for one of our free video courses on Aquinas. And don't forget to subscribe, like, and share with your friends, because it matters what you think.